There are over 25,000 unique cards in Magic the Gathering, but how many are truly unplayable in the Commander format? This video, I want to talk about an unusual sorcery spell that one random YouTuber described as the magic equivalent of a damp sponge. And that card is Fateful Handoff. Fateful Handoff is a 4-mana sorcery that costs 3 generic and 1 black mana. It reads, draw cards equal to the mana value of target artifact or creature you control. An opponent gains control of that permanent. Released in Brothers War, Fateful Handoff has seen almost zero competitive play and shows up in just under 8,000 decks on EDH Rec. For context, that's over 2,000 fewer decks than a card like Feed the Infection, a comparable 4-mana sorcery spell that draws you cards from Phyrexia All Will Be One, a set released 5 months after Brothers War. I mention this to show just how little hype Fateful Handoff has received. I think most players would agree that cards like Feed the Infection are generally just okay in Commander. And yet, it's been added to more deck lists in less time. And that's a shame, because Fateful Handoff has a much higher ceiling than a generic draw spell like Feed the Infection. And in the right deck, it straight up feels like you're cheating. Let's take a look at some popular strategies and archetypes that can really take advantage of Fateful Handoff. First, the most obvious way to use Fateful Handoff is with a bad gift strategy. I covered this when I talked about Dubious Challenge in another video, but if you're already playing actively bad creatures and artifacts that you want to give to your opponents, Fateful Handoff is an auto-include. I mean, it only costs 1 more mana than Donate or Harmless Offering, and it draws you cards. Looking at EDH Rec, it seems that most bad gift players are already aware of this card. Blim Comedic Genius, for example, is running Fateful Handoff in 75% of its listed decks. Some other commanders who may already be doing this strategy include Solkanar the Tainted, John Irenicus Shattered One, Corona False God, and Cody Vociferous Codex. I'd like to call out Corona False God players in particular here. Regardless of what else you might be doing, you will be giving your commander to every other player every turn. That means Fateful Handoff is essentially a 4-mana draw 6 with no downside. And yet it only shows up in 128 out of about 3,300 decks on EDH Rec. Really? What are you doing, Corona players? Put this card in your deck. If you're interested in this strategy, there are a ton of hilarious cards you can gift your opponents. Abyssal Prosecutor can completely stop someone from winning the game, or maybe you send over an Archfiend of the Dross with a single oil counter left to kill someone on their upkeep. Steel Golem shuts down creature decks. Evil Eye of Ormsby basically does the same for Voltron strategies. Even cards like Immortal Coil and Lich's Tomb can take a player out surprisingly fast. While you won't make many friends with the strategy, it is a lot of fun for the person playing it. One more card I want to mention before moving on is Homeward Path. If you're running any kind of creature exchange or bad gift deck, Homeward Path is an auto-include, as you can tap it to snatch back your stuff at instant speed, either to remove them from combat, use them as blockers, or even just give them to someone else. Moving on, the deck archetype I probably talk about the most on my channel is Blink and or Bounce. And again, this card works extremely well with either theme. If you have a consistent way to blink the creature or artifact you just donated back to your side of the battlefield, then Fateful Handoff is straight gas. Here's a real-world example that actually served as the inspiration for this video. I have an Aminato the Fateshifter deck, and in one of my recent games I cast a discounted Demonic Junker for just 4 mana. When it entered, I destroyed 3 of my opponent's creatures. Awesome! I then gifted my opponent Demonic Junker with Fateful Handoff, drawing 7 cards. Finally, I used my commander's -1 ability to blink Demonic Junker back to my side of the table and destroy another 3 creatures. Brutal! This single play catapulted me into the lead, and I was able to win the game shortly after that. Outside of Aminato, other Blink commanders who may be interested in Fateful Handoff include Gyruda, Doom of Depths, Triad of the Fates, Aetherios Shroud Veiled, Sharum the Hegemon, Evelyn the Covetous, and more. Some other great cards to consider giving away, before you take it right back that is, include Archon of Cruelty, Hoarding Broodlord, Portal to Phyrexia, Spine of Ishsa, and Coveted Jewel. In fact, Coveted Jewel might be the best card to pair with Fateful Handoff. Think about it. Let's say you cast it for 6 mana and draw 3 cards. It immediately refunds 3 mana, which you can then use to cast Fateful Handoff, gifting the jewel to an opponent and drawing another 6 cards. Ideally, you give the jewel to someone without a blocker, so you can then swing at them, regain control of coveted jewel, draw another 3 cards, and get refunded another 3 mana. I mean, who doesn't want to draw 12 cards in a single turn? I also want to mention Liquimetal Torque and Liquimetal Coating, which can turn your permanents into artifact. This is relevant for many Blink decks, as turning an enchantment or battle into an artifact means you can target it with cards like the Eternal Wanderer or Teleportation Circle. Similarly, Fateful Handoff can only donate creatures and artifacts. So if you want to use Fateful Handoff with more unusual permanent types, like maybe a Demonic Pact or Invasion of Fiora, the Liquimetal cards are your best bet. Next up, we have a smaller, more niche theme to talk about, Threaten or Active Treason decks. As you can see from the namesake cards, these decks want to temporarily gain control of an opponent's creature, attack with it, and then sacrifice it for additional value, usually to something like Goblin Bombardment or Fling. Of course, later in the game, you might want to refill your hand instead, and that's where Fateful Handoff comes in. Rather than sacrifice the creature you steal, why not give it back, or even worse, give it to someone else while also drawing a bunch of cards. There are dozens of threaten effects in the format, and while I won't list them all, here are some of my personal favorites. Furnace Rains, Seize the Spotlight, Mass Mutiny, Harness by Force, Hijack, and Word of Seizing, because Split Second is really fun. Some commanders who may already be doing this include The Beast, Deathless Prince, Kethek, Crucible Goliath, Tevish Zot, Doom of Fools, Ziatora the Incinerator, and the most famous Theft commander in the format, Marchesa the Black Rose. Alright, let's move on to my final category, decks with delayed end-step triggers. And that might sound a little weird, but I don't know what else to call it. Essentially, I'm referring to the many commanders and decks that are exiling, destroying, and bouncing on end step. Like Unearth, for example. When you activate an Unearth ability, you essentially get one turn with a permanent before a delayed trigger exiles that permanent at your end step. And that delayed trigger will happen whether or not you still control that permanent. Let's say you're running a Mishra, Tamer of Makfawa, or Cedrus the Trader deck, for example. You can use your commander's ability to bring back a huge creature or artifact from your graveyard for just 3 mana. Then attack with or activate that permanent before giving it away with Fateful Handoff. You'll draw a bunch of cards, and at your end step, the Unearth trigger will exile that permanent as normal. How is that not an incredible draw spell? And yet, Fateful Handoff shows up in less than 1% of those decks. One important clarification, however, is that delayed sacrifice triggers will not work if your opponent has control of your permanent. For best results, look for triggers that exile or return that permanent to your hand. Now, you might be thinking, sure, Fateful Handoff works great with Unearth, but that's like 2 decks? Who cares? Well, first, there's actually 3 decks because Moira and Tashar are also basically doing an Unearth strategy. And second, it turns out there are tons of other decks already using delayed end-step triggers that can abuse Fateful Handoff. For example, many spells and abilities that make a token copy of a creature work with this strategy. Spells like Twin Flame and Heat Shimmer, Mimic Vat and Splinter Twin, Flame Shadow Conjuring and Molten Echoes. These token copies retain the original card's mana value, making them excellent fits next to Fateful Handoff. You've also got plenty of cards that bounce a permanent back to hand at end step, like Greasefang Okiba Boss for example. Fateful Handoff is incredible here, drawing you 6 or more cards with ease as you reanimate giant vehicles every turn. Some other examples include Allura, Merry Thief, Dragon Mask, Dust Stalker, Ilharg the Razeboar, Zara Renegade Recruiter, and Riders of the Mark. All of these creatures create a delayed trigger that can be abused with Fateful Handoff. One more thing I'll mention in this strategy is Echo. While technically not an end step trigger, you can get some enters the battlefield value out of an expensive Echo creature like Karmic Guide or Crater Hellion before sending them to an opponent who either can't or won't pay the Echo cost. Not amazing, but worth at least a little consideration. Okay, like always, it's time to look again at Fateful Handoff and ask ourselves, is this card unplayable in Commander? No, and I would argue that it's much better than a card like Feed the Infection. Sure, there might be situations where you can't use it, but the risk is definitely worth the reward. I give it 4.9 dumpsters out of 7, a truly underrated gem that fits in way more decks than you'd think. At any rate, thanks for watching, and let me know what you think of Fateful Handoff in the comments below. Is this secret tech actually busted, or is the juice not worth the squeeze? And don't forget to leave suggestions for cards you want me to review in the future. And as always, like and subscribe to help my channel grow.